The evening Arthur Whitmore had planned for 6 weeks was supposed to be perfect. A quiet corner table at Hensley's, Chicago's most celebrated steakhouse, candlelight, a bottle of Chateau Margaux, and the moment he finally asked Diane Castillo to marry him. He had the ring in his jacket pocket. He had rehearsed the words in the car, and he had absolutely no idea that a shivering 10-year-old boy, crouched behind the restaurant's service entrance, had just heard something that would change both their lives forever. Arthur was 53 years old, the kind of man who had built things. Not just the construction firm that bore his name, but the quiet, ordered life he'd arranged around himself after his first marriage ended. No children, no chaos. A penthouse on Lakeshore Drive with clean lines and uncluttered surfaces, and a calendar that he controlled down to the hour. He wasn't cold, exactly. He was precise. People sometimes confused the two. Diane had come into his life 18 months ago at a foundation gala, introduced through mutual friends. She was 41, elegant, sharp-witted, with a laugh that surprised him the first time he heard it. Loud and completely unguarded, nothing like the composed woman who sat across from him at charity dinners. He had fallen for both versions of her, the composed one and the one who laughed too loud. The evening began beautifully. She wore a deep burgundy dress he'd never seen before. The host knew his name. Sommelier uncorked the wine without ceremony. Arthur touched the small velvet box in his pocket twice during the appetizers, reassuring himself it was still there. "You seem distracted," Diane said, between bites of her scallop. "Just enjoying the moment," Arthur replied, and meant it partly. But something had been nudging at the edges of his attention all evening. A slight stiffness in her posture when he'd reached for her hand, a half-second delay before she smiled at a joke. He was a man who built things, which meant he was a man who noticed stress fractures before they became collapses. He excused himself to use the restroom just before dessert arrived. He was washing his hands when the back door of the hallway, the service corridor, poorly marked, swung open and a small figure scrambled through it. The boy was maybe 10, maybe younger. Dark hoodie, jeans with a tear at the left knee, sneakers with the soles separating from the canvas. He froze when he saw Arthur, like a deer calculating whether to run. "Hey," Arthur said, keeping his voice low. "You lost?" The boy shook his head. His eyes were dark and serious, far too serious for a child's face, and they darted toward the dining room. "The lady you're with, the one in the red dress." Arthur went still. "What about her? She was outside earlier. Before the restaurant opened, she met a man by the alley." The boy hesitated, clearly working out how much to say. "I heard them. She said tonight's the night. Said she was going to tell you yes, and then she's out. Said she couldn't keep doing it." Arthur stared at him. "Keep doing what?" The boy swallowed. "I don't know exactly, but the man gave her an envelope, a thick one, and she said she just needs to close this out and they can leave. Go somewhere he has money waiting." The door at the end of the hallway opened. A waiter appeared, startled to see them both. "Sir, I'm so sorry, this area is for staff. It's fine." Arthur reached into his wallet and found a 20. He held it out to the boy. "What's your name?" But the boy was already backing toward the service door. He looked at the 20, then at Arthur's face, and something passed across his expression. Not greed, not calculation. Just the particular exhaustion of a child who has done a hard thing and isn't sure whether it mattered. "My name's not important," he said. "I just didn't want you to get played." And then he was gone, the service door swinging shut behind him, and Arthur was left standing in the staff hallway with a $20 bill in his hand, and a ring in his pocket, and 18 months of memories suddenly rearranging themselves into a shape he didn't recognize. He walked back to the table slowly. Diane looked up when he sat down, her smile easy and warm, and he smiled back and asked her how she liked her entree, and they talked about ordinary things, a trip they'd discussed in September, a film opening that weekend, and Arthur watched her the way he watched structural blueprints. Looking for the thing that didn't line up, he found it when the dessert arrived. Hensley's signature chocolate torte, 1 slice each. As the server set the plates down, Arthur's phone buzzed with a text from his assistant that he genuinely needed to answer, and he watched Diane glance at her purse. A quick, reflexive check, the kind you make when you're waiting for something. Her own phone, screen side down on the table, lit up briefly. She didn't reach for it, but her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Everything okay?" Arthur asked. "Perfect," she said, lifting her dessert fork. He reached across the table and turned her phone face up before she could react. The preview on the screen read, "Done for the night? Need confirmation before we move." The name above it read. Diane's hand went to her phone immediately, but Arthur had already seen what he needed. The ring stayed in his pocket. He didn't make a scene. He was not a man who made scenes. He signaled for the check with the same unhurried gesture he used in board meetings, paid without consulting the bill, helped Diane with her coat, and walked her to the car. She knew something had shifted. He could feel her trying to locate it, her conversation growing more careful, more attentive. He gave her nothing. At her building, she touched his arm before stepping out. "Arthur, what's wrong? You've been somewhere else since dessert." "Just tired," he said. "Long week. I'll call you tomorrow." He did not call her tomorrow. Instead, he sat in his penthouse at midnight with a glass of scotch he barely touched and a phone in his hand, scrolling back through 18 months. The trips she'd suggested, the decisions that had quietly benefited her. A consulting contract steered her firm's way, introductions made, his name used in rooms he hadn't known he was in. Nothing he could call criminal. Everything that, in retrospect, traced a pattern. He thought about the boy. A child who had no reason to involve himself in the troubles of a stranger in a steakhouse. Who had run away before Arthur could thank him or even properly look at him. Who had handed him the most important information of his adult life and disappeared into a Chicago night like it was nothing. He needed to find him. The Hensleys' manager was accommodating in the way that people tend to be when a man of Arthur's profile asks a careful question. The security footage from the alley showed the boy arriving around 5:45 p.m., lingering near the dumpsters, leaving briefly, returning. He had the practiced, unhurried movement of a child who knew how to not be noticed. A cook recognized him. "He comes around sometimes on Wednesdays," she said. "We put the bread out Wednesdays. Day-old rolls, pastries. Some of us set a bag by the dumpster. Has he ever spoken to anyone?" "Not really. Polite, though. Said thank you once when my coworker saw him and didn't yell at him to leave." Arthur drove to the alley the following Wednesday. He was there at 5:30, sitting in an unremarkable rental car he'd borrowed from his assistant specifically so he wouldn't be recognized. The boy appeared at 5:47. Same hoodie. Arthur got out of the car. The boy saw him and went rigid. For a moment, Arthur thought he'd bolt. Then some calculation happened behind those serious dark eyes, and the boy held his ground. "I'm not here to get you in trouble," Arthur said. "I'm here because you helped me, and I didn't get a chance to thank you properly. You didn't need to come back," the boy said carefully. "I know." Arthur paused. "Were you right about what you heard?" The boy said nothing, which was itself an answer. "You were right," Arthur said. "The woman, we're not together anymore. And it turns out there's quite a bit I didn't know about her that I probably should have." He let that sit. "How often do you come here?" A shrug. "Wednesdays, sometimes Fridays. Where do you sleep?" The boy's expression closed, around. Arthur didn't push. "Are you hungry right now?" "Not from a dumpster. I mean from an actual restaurant." "I'm fine." "I know you're fine. Are you hungry?" A long pause. "Maybe." They went to a diner 2 blocks away, a real one, with vinyl booths and a laminated menu and a waitress who called everyone honey without irony. The boy ordered a burger, fries, a chocolate milkshake, and orange juice, surveying the menu with the focused attention of someone who understands scarcity. Arthur ordered coffee and watched. "My name's Arthur," he said. "I know," the boy said. "You have buildings named after you. What's your name?" Another pause. Not hostile, more like the boy was deciding how much of himself to hand over. "Samson," he said finally. "But everyone calls me Sam. How old are you, Sam?" 11, almost 12. "Where's your family?" Sam wrapped both hands around his milkshake glass. "My grandma died 8 months ago. She was the one I was with." He said it simply, the way children sometimes describe devastation, not because it doesn't hurt, but because they've already spent a long time sitting with it. "There's no one else." Arthur felt something in his chest that he hadn't felt in years. Not pity, something older than pity, a recognition. He had lost his own father at 12, had spent 2 years in the kind of drifting, half-managed grief that can either make or ruin a person. He had been one of the lucky ones. Someone had intervened. "What happened after she died?" "Where did you go?" "They put me with a family for a while." Then another one. Sam took a long pull of his milkshake. "I left the second one. It wasn't a good place." Arthur didn't ask for details. Some things a child shouldn't have to explain twice. You've been on your own since then? 8 months, Sam said with a matter-of-factness that broke something open in Arthur Whitmore's carefully ordered life. He didn't make any promises that first night. He had enough self-awareness to know that a man who'd nearly proposed to a woman running a long con was not a man whose instincts deserved full confidence at the moment. He asked if he could meet Sam again the following Wednesday. Sam agreed with the studied nonchalance of a child who had learned not to let himself want things too openly, but he showed up, and the Wednesday after that, and the one after that. Arthur's attorney began making inquiries about emergency foster placement and temporary guardianship. His housekeeper, a woman named Ruby, who had worked for him for 9 years, listened to the situation with a steady expression and said, "About time this apartment had someone in it who actually needed something," which was the closest she came to approval. The truth about Diane came out slowly, the way these things do. Her real name was Diane. That much was genuine. But the Diane who'd attended that gala 18 months ago had been positioned there deliberately, introduced by a mutual friend who turned out to be less mutual than Arthur had believed. The man in the alley, the one who'd handed her the envelope, was traced by Arthur's security consultant to a loose network that had successfully worked similar operations on 3 other men, 2 in Chicago, 1 in Atlanta. Arthur gave everything he knew to the detective assigned to the case. Her name was Forsyth, and she had the compact efficiency of someone who had seen most things twice. "You're lucky," Forsyth said, reviewing the timeline. "If you'd proposed that night, it would have changed the legal landscape considerably once she had a ring." "I know," Arthur said. "I had a little help." He told her about Sam. Forsyth's expression shifted in a way that was difficult to name. "The boy has no legal identity on record," she said. "His grandmother was undocumented. He doesn't exist on paper. He exists," Arthur said. "I can assure you of that." The temporary guardianship was approved 6 weeks after Arthur first walked into that alley. The paperwork was substantial, and the home study was thorough. 2 visits, 1 announced and 1 not, and Arthur passed both, partly because of the care he'd taken, and partly because Ruby had quietly made the guest room into something that looked like it had been waiting for a child. Warm colors, books on the shelf that an 11-year-old might actually read, a desk by the window with a view of the lake. Sam stood in the doorway of the room for a long time the first night. "You can go in," Arthur said. "It's yours." "I know," Sam said, but he didn't move yet. He was the kind of child who needed to understand the terms of a thing before he committed to it. Arthur recognized this tendency. He had it himself. "I'm not going to pretend this isn't strange," Arthur said, leaning against the hallway wall. "I'm a 53-year-old man who builds parking structures and lives alone. I don't know everything about what to do here, but I know I'm going to do it anyway." Sam turned to look at him. "Why?" "Because you did something kind when you didn't have to, and because you've been alone too long." Arthur paused. "And because I think we might be good for each other." Sam considered this with the serious, systematic deliberation that Arthur had come to recognize as his natural mode of processing the world. Then he walked into the room, set his backpack on the desk chair, and said, "I'm going to need better shoes." Arthur laughed, genuinely, the way he hadn't in months. "That we can absolutely fix." The months that followed were not easy in all the ways they were beautiful. Sam had nightmares for the first several weeks. Arthur would hear him through the wall and find him sitting up in bed, not crying, just awake and watchful, with the practiced stillness of a child who had learned that showing distress didn't reliably produce help. Arthur would sit on the edge of the bed without making a big thing of it, and after a while Sam would lie back down, and eventually they stopped without either of them announcing that they had. School was a complicated negotiation. Sam was sharp, genuinely, remarkably sharp, with the kind of reading comprehension that comes from having spent long hours alone with books, but his formal education had significant gaps. A tutor came 3 afternoons a week and reported back to Arthur with barely concealed admiration. "He doesn't miss things twice," she said. "Tell him something once, it's in there." Arthur took him to his construction sites on Saturdays. Sam was fascinated by the process, the scaffolding, the sequencing, the way a building had to account for its own weight. He asked questions that were better than the questions grown men asked on tours. The foreman, a veteran named Ed who'd worked with Arthur for 15 years, told Arthur privately one afternoon, "That kid's got an engineer's brain. Don't let that go to waste. I won't, Arthur said, and meant it as a promise. Detective Forsyth kept them updated on the case. Diane and her associate were arrested 4 months after that night at Hensley's. The evidence was considerable: financial records, communications, the testimony of one of the other victims who had finally come forward. Forsyth called Arthur the morning of the arrest, professional as always, but he could hear something underneath the efficiencies. Satisfaction, maybe. Sam's testimony about what he overheard in the alley won't be necessary, she told him, but it was what opened the case. Without him, we would never have had reason to look. Arthur relayed this to Sam over breakfast. Sam listened, ate a piece of toast, and said, "Good." Then after a moment, "She seemed nice, though, the lady, when I saw her from far away. Before I heard what she was saying, she could seem nice," Arthur agreed. "That was part of it," Sam nodded. "People are confusing." "Yes," Arthur said, "they really are." The formal adoption hearing was on a Tuesday in late March, when Chicago was doing its reluctant thaw. Gray skies, patches of ice still on the north-facing sidewalks, crocuses trying their luck along the courthouse steps. Sam wore a collared shirt, and the dark jeans Arthur's assistant had helped him pick out, and the new shoes, good ones, properly fitted, which Sam had scrutinized with the seriousness of a man making a significant investment. Arthur wore a suit he'd last worn to a groundbreaking ceremony, which felt appropriate. The judge was a heavy-set man named Calloway, who had been doing family court for 20 years and had the worn steadiness that comes from witnessing both the worst and the best of what people do to and for one another. He reviewed the documentation, asked Arthur several direct questions about his understanding of permanent responsibility, and then turned to Sam. "Son," he said, "you understand what adoption means, that this becomes permanent, that Mr. Whitmore becomes your legal father." "Yes, sir," Sam said, "and that's what you want." Sam looked at Arthur, not for permission, Arthur understood, but in the way that people look at the things they're deciding to trust. It was a brief look, an assessment. "Yes," Sam said, "that's what I want." Judge Calloway signed the paperwork with a pen that had clearly signed thousands of documents, and then he set it down and looked at them both over his glasses with an expression that was as close to warmth as a family court judge in his 20th year probably allowed himself. "Congratulations," he said. "Take care of each other." Outside the courthouse, Arthur's assistant had organized a small celebration at a restaurant nearby. Nothing elaborate, because Sam had made it clear he found elaborate things exhausting. Arthur's oldest friend and business partner was there, and Ruby, and the tutor, and Detective Forsyth, who came in her regular clothes and seemed slightly uncomfortable in a celebratory context, which Arthur found endearing. Sam shook everyone's hands with formal seriousness, and then relaxed slightly when Ed the foreman appeared with a card signed by the entire construction crew, which made him laugh. Really laugh. The same way he had the day Arthur had let him climb the scaffolding on a secured floor and look out at the city from above, that full and uncomplicated sound that Arthur had been quietly cataloging each time he heard it. That evening, after everyone had gone, they sat on the balcony of the Lake Shore Drive apartment. Sam's apartment now, the legal document said so, and watched the last of the daylight go out over the water. Chicago in March did not offer elegant sunsets, but there was something in the gray-pink light on the lake, something honest and unhurried, that Arthur had always found more moving than the dramatic ones. "I've been thinking about what to call you," Sam said eventually. He had both hands wrapped around a mug of hot chocolate, his preferred evening drink, a habit Arthur had stopped questioning. Like, what to say when I'm talking to you or about you. Arthur kept his eyes on the water. "You don't have to decide anything tonight." "I know," Sam said. "I've been thinking about it for a while, though," and a pause. Not hesitation. Sam rarely hesitated. More like the careful setting down of a heavy thing. "Dad seems right," he said, "if that's okay." Arthur took a moment before he answered. Not because he needed to think about it, but because some answers deserve a breath before they're given. "More than okay," he said. Sam nodded once, satisfied, the way he was when he confirmed a calculation. He took a sip of his hot chocolate. Then, "You're going to need to learn to cook something. You can't just have Ruby feed us forever. I can learn. You're slow in the kitchen." "I'm methodical," Arthur said. "There's a difference." Sam's mouth curved. "Ed says that too. When he does something wrong, Ed and I have worked together for 15 years. There's a reason for that. Because you're both methodical." Because we both know when we're wrong and neither of us says it out loud. Sam laughed again. Then he settled back in his chair and looked at the lake. And Arthur looked at it too, and they stayed there until the cold drove them in, the kind of comfortable, unforced quiet that takes a long time to build and once built is one of the most valuable things two people can have. Spring arrived in genuine earnest 6 weeks after the adoption, the way Chicago spring eventually does. Sudden and extravagant, green coming up everywhere at once as if the city had been holding its breath. Sam started at his new school in April, a mid-year enrollment that the principal had accommodated with more grace than Arthur had expected. He came home on his 3rd day and said that a boy in his math class had asked where he lived, and when Sam said Lakeshore Drive, the boy had said no way, and Sam had said way, and they'd apparently been friends since. His name was Bennett. He came over on Saturdays sometimes while Arthur worked in his study, and the two of them took over the kitchen table with elaborate projects. Model bridges, a volcano for a science fair that Ruby observed with a mixture of interest and structural concern, a map of the Chicago L system annotated with what Sam considered its significant design flaws. Arthur sat in on that last one. The flaws were, in his professional opinion, well identified. "You should be an engineer," Arthur said. Sam looked up with the expression of someone who has already made a decision but hasn't announced it yet. "I know," he said. "That's the plan." The Diane case resolved in September. She pleaded guilty to fraud and conspiracy charges and received a sentence that Forsyth described as appropriate. Arthur went to the sentencing and sat in the back and felt less than he expected to. Not forgiveness exactly, but a kind of neutrality. She had tried to take something from him. What she had inadvertently given him instead was incalculable. He did not tell Sam the details of the sentencing. Sam knew the broad shape of the case and had offered his testimony in a preliminary statement that had ultimately not been needed. He didn't ask about the outcome, and Arthur wondered sometimes if this was because Sam had decided it was over and filed it away, which was very much in character, or because he'd understood that the chapter had closed and what mattered now was the one they were writing. One Saturday morning in October, Arthur and Sam went back to Hensley's for breakfast. It had become an occasional ritual, partly because Sam found the idea of eating at a fancy steakhouse at 8 in the morning quietly hilarious, and partly, Arthur knew, because it was the place their story had started. They were finishing their eggs when Sam spotted a girl standing just inside the entrance, maybe 9 years old, alone, her coat too thin for October. She had the particular stillness of a child trying to appear as though she had somewhere to be. Sam saw her the same moment Arthur did. He watched her for a moment without saying anything. "Dad," he said quietly. 10 o'clock. Arthur looked. "I see her." They both sat with it for a moment. Then Sam said, "We can't just—" "No," Arthur agreed. "We can't." Arthur caught their server's eye and spoke to her quietly. A few minutes later, the hostess approached the girl with a warm manner that managed not to be condescending and said there was a table by the window, with a breakfast order that had been made by mistake and would go to waste otherwise if she'd like to sit down. The girl looked at the hostess, looked at the table, looked across the room at no one in particular, because Arthur and Sam had carefully returned to their own conversation. She sat down. Sam watched from his peripheral vision and said nothing for a moment. Then, "I used to do that. The standing near the entrance thing. You can smell the food without going in." Arthur kept his voice even. "I know. How do we make sure she's okay?" "After breakfast, I've already sent a message to Forsyth. She knows people who handle this without making it scary." Sam nodded slowly. "It won't be that easy for her." "Whatever comes next." "No," Arthur said. "It won't be easy, but someone will see her. That matters." Sam looked at his plate for a moment. Then he reached into his pocket and put a 20 on the edge of the table. His own money, earned from a project he'd done for Ed's crew last summer, cataloging equipment for a small fee that Ed had insisted on paying. "For her check," he said, "in case she worries about it." Arthur looked at his son, this serious, careful, generous boy who had once crouched behind a dumpster and decided that a stranger's life mattered enough to risk his own safety, who was now sitting in a warm restaurant on a Saturday morning and making the same calculation about someone else. "You know," Arthur said, "when I first saw you in that hallway, I thought you were one of the bravest people I'd ever met." Sam looked uncomfortable with this, which was typical. "I just told you what I heard. You told the truth when it would have been easy not to. To a stranger. with nothing to gain. Arthur folded his napkin. That's the whole thing, Sam. That's the whole definition of it. Sam was quiet for a moment. Outside, the October light came through the window at a low angle and caught the steam rising from their coffee cups. "She'll be okay," Sam said finally, with the quiet certainty of someone who knows that being okay is not a given, but has decided to believe in it anyway. "People show up. Sometimes they do." Arthur looked at his son. "Sometimes they do," he agreed.